Started. I'm very pleased to welcome Molly Roberts to our humble, or not so humble setting, I guess, as the case may be. It's a particular treat because Molly has been one of the great innovators in terms of doing research, both in terms of talking about Chinese politics, as well as thinking around the role of technology in politics. We often think of the internet, or used to think about the internet in semi-utopian terms, and now I think we've definitely shifted to this week it feels especially like we're in a dystopian world, and I'm afraid this talk might not help. But like I think one of the early utopian views was the internet would enable this free flow of information, and it's inherently good for democracy, and so on. And I think that we've certainly seen that's not necessarily the case. And in particular, when we look at China, we can see these particular efforts to constrain and limit and control the flow of information with non-trivial success. And I think that that Molly has been the very leader in examining the instrumentality of control of information flow in China. And this is going to be, I think, the work we're going to hear today, which, and I should note, by the way, this isn't just the title of a great talk, but it's the title of a great book, which if you go to Amazon, you could buy it now, which pulls together a series of studies that Molly did into a broader narrative around information technology, democracy, and Chinese politics, and I think it will have a lasting imprint on the field. I could go on a while longer, but that would be a poor choice of time. So Molly, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. This is awesome. I'm really excited to tell you about the book and get your feedback and insights. So I'm going to kind of start with something that I've been puzzling over for a really long time, which is what I call sort of China's censorship paradox. So in China, there's this sort of high-volume, vibrant, innovative internet. So the Chinese internet is kind of the place to be right now. There's these amazing social media companies like WeChat or social media apps like WeChat that sort of do more than any of the things that are popular in the US. There's tons of people online talking all the time, exchanging ideas. This is, if you talk to any investors in Wall Street, they're just like, which is the next tech China company I should invest in? So this is a really, really dynamic space. At the same time, some of the sort of hottest internet companies in the world. So Lu Wei, former director of the State Internet Information Office in China, says, China has 4 million websites, 700 million internet users, 1.2 billion mobile phone users, 600 million WeChat and Weibo users, and generates 30 billion pieces of information every day. So this is like a huge, amazing, really vibrant space, the internet in China. At the same time, China is also known to have one of the most sort of extensive censorship systems in history. And this is sort of hard to square, right? The Chinese government, we know, jails and intimidates social media users, blocks foreign websites from entering China with the Great Firewall, which is probably the most infamous form of censorship, employs thousands of censors to individually and by hand remove social media posts, filters search to remove or downweight certain results, so it has like certain rules for doing search filtering, and hires government astroturfers to distract from ongoing events. So this is like just a few of the different things that the Chinese government does to try to control this space. And so I've studied a few of these in the past, especially the hiring government of astroturfers and removing social media posts. But instead of trying to study what the Chinese government censors, what I'm going to try to puzzle over is why does the Chinese government try to censor something so obviously, or what seems to be on the front of it, so uncensorable, right? 30 billion pieces of information every day. How could you possibly control that type of flow, right? So the questions I'm going to sort of struggle with is, does censorship actually impact access to information? And why doesn't repression sort of force risk-averse consumers offline? So we often think of sort of repression as, and like repression and vibrant spaces is sort of, they don't really go together, right? If there's a lot of repression, there's a lot of fear, and that means that people sort of don't want to take risks and they don't want to be innovative. And so how do we have this like extremely vibrant, internet environment at the same time as having a very repressive one? So why doesn't the world's sort of most dynamic internet marketplace how can it also be that of the most heavy-handed regulation? Yeah. So one answer to this puzzle is that censorship just doesn't work, okay? So we have people in the press that sort of say things like, this is from a Wall Street Journal op-ed, James Zimmerman, the Great Firewall is ineffective. Almost anyone, including Chinese journalists, academics, government officials, can bypass the censors and access foreign sources of information by using a virtual private network or a VPN. So one answer to this question is the Chinese government spends tons and tons of money doing things that don't work, and therefore there's still a vibrant internet marketplace. The other sort of side of this, another answer kind of on the other end of the spectrum, is that fear in China purifies the internet, okay? So here's from another op-ed in The Diplomat, is that Chinese society has moved to an era of self-censorship where people themselves automatically purify the internet. So that the line is so clear, right, that you can have a vibrant internet because everyone knows exactly what's on and off limits and nobody crosses those lines, okay? So the answer that I'm going to have today is sort of neither of these, right? Is that censorship works, but it works by distraction and diversion, okay? It sort of nudges but does not force most users away from unsavory material. So censorship in China is porous, it's circumventable. You can get around most censorship. It's not complete, right? But people in general, and one thing that we really know in political science is that people are busy, impatient, and uninformed about politics. They don't want to spend a lot of time or go out of their way to find political information. And this means that they're very affected by censorship, especially when they can explain it away or they don't realize they're actually being censored. Okay? So this allows the fact that most people can kind of be nudged away from unsavory material online in China means that the government can kind of reserve blatant repression and fear for very particular people like high-profile social media users, the media, and academics. So they can sort of target fear-based repression toward particular people while not having to use it for the majority of individuals. So the basic argument is that censorship is sort of just diverting people on the web to things that the Chinese government likes better, right? But this sort of Achilles heel of this strategy is that there are time periods where people care more about searching out information. So I also argue in the book that there's sort of there's certain moments when this strategy is undercut. And in particular, sudden disruptions in crises are time periods when users are willing to actually circumvent censorship. And these are often also the time periods when the government needs censorship most. Sometimes the time periods when the government needs censorship most. So this whole nudging strategy relies on the indifference and impatience of people online. And there are some time periods when people are not indifferent or impatient. And those time periods are the time periods when we see censorship not working as well. Okay, so Lu Wei, just to finish Lu Wei's quote, he said, China has 4 million websites, generates 30 billion pieces of information every day, and he says, it's not possible to apply censorship to this enormous amount of data. Thus, censorship is not the correct word choice. But no censorship does not mean no management. And the Chinese government in general talks about censorship as information management. And I think this is the strategy we sort of see in China. So I think one of the reasons why it's sort of unclear whether censorship works or doesn't or when it does is that we don't really have a theory of how censorship works and how censorship impacts people. And so in the book, I kind of draw out 3 mechanisms of censorship, or 3 ways in which censorship affects people's consumption of information. And all of these 3 start with F, so they're easy to remember, okay? So the first is fear, okay? So censorship can work by making people afraid. And this is when the government sort of threatens punishment for spreading or accessing a particular type of information. So this would be this is a deterrence method, right? You deter people from reading or writing about something, because if they do, then you're going to punish them in some way. So the problem with fear is that it must be observable in order to work, right? In order for people to be deterred, they must actually know that they're what they shouldn't say, and then also that they will be punished for saying the wrong thing, right? And this creates some problems for the government, right? So we know that censorship can create backlash. So people don't really like being censored. So sometimes this can create backlash, right? It can also draw people to information, particularly if it isn't credible. So like the best way to get people to read something is to tell them they can't read it, right? Is to draw them toward this information or try to go get that type of information. And it also creates information gathering problems in authoritarian regimes. So one of the things we know about authoritarian governments is that they have a really hard time figuring out what the people want. Okay, so unlike in democracies where you have these moments of elections where people sort of tell the government what they want, in authoritarian regimes there's some problems with gathering information, and it's a particular problem when there's a lot of fear, because then people falsify their preferences, and then you get what you think of as like these sort of unanticipated protests where you didn't really see them coming, right? So authoritarian governments have a hard time collecting information, and the more you use fear, the more trouble they have if it's really effective, the more trouble they have for figuring out before it's too late what they're doing wrong. So the second mechanism of censorship is friction. So this, I think most of the time when people think about censorship, they think about fear, they think about like laws that are passed in order to prevent people from saying things. But maybe more often, censorship manifests itself through friction, which is that friction just makes information sort of more costly to find and spread. So instead of saying this information is off limits, I'm just going to put barriers between you and this information, make you spend more time or money accessing it. So friction itself doesn't have to be visible in order to be effective. So take, for example, you go to a library and you ask for a book and they don't have it. You don't know whether or not it's just like not that good of a book, or the government has like told the library that they can't actually have it, right? Or say you go to a web page and you try to access the web page and you get an error. Is the web page down, or is the government blocking it? There's some sort of ambiguity about what's actually going on. So friction relies on the indifference and impatience of people to work. So if you go to the library and you can't find the book, if you really care about it, you could order it off of Amazon. But maybe you don't really care that much, and there's another book right there, and like it's fine. So you just kind of go on with your life, right? So the more people are sort of indifferent or impatient, or the more I think about it as sort of they have elastic demand for information, the more they're affected by friction. Friction also is sort of useful to governments because it separates out the masses from the activists. So some people within the society are going to find that information because they are willing to go out of their way to get that information. And these people are sort of going to be more like the activists. They're going to be more like the people who really care about this issue. But for most people, they're not going to really care. And so the people who are actually accessing the information are going to be different from the people who don't access that type of information. The last mechanism of censorship that I introduced in the book is called flooding. So flooding is introducing noise or distractions, like making the airwaves a little more noisy in order to create censorship. So usually people don't think about flooding as a form of censorship. But I argue in the book that it also is a form of censorship, that flooding creates friction, basically, because it dilutes the information environment and it makes things harder to find. Okay? Flooding is also probably the least visible form of censorship. So even if you know that somebody is introducing something, you're not exactly sure what they're trying to distract from, right? I got this. Somehow I exited. Okay, here we go. No. I'll just use this. So it makes, basically the idea with flooding is it makes separating out good and bad information more difficult or more time consuming, right? So you're not really sure which information is good and which is bad or false. You're not really sure which information is the things you should be reading and what's not. And it makes coming across diluted information less likely. So you can think about in like a Russian case that you have these sort of like Russian bots flooding protest hashtags, right, with like punctuation or whatever, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to like actually coordinate around that hashtag. So in the book, I talk a lot about how the Chinese government over the years has sort of shifted from a very fear-based strategy under Mao to a really more friction and flooding strategy in the more recent time period. And how this has sort of been pushed by their desire to sort of enter the world and allow people more freedom in order to to enter the economy, but also by the advent of the internet, because the internet, with so many more people entering into the public sphere, makes it very difficult to deter everyone, but makes some of these friction and flooding methods much easier. Okay? So the shift has sort of happened both with China's entrance into the world, into the global economy, and also into as the internet has become more available. So in the book I go through a lot of different examples. China has many different types of censorship. And in the book I go through many different types of examples of online removal of posts, astroturfing on the web, using newspapers to push propaganda. But today, what I just want to focus on one of these types, and I'll sort of show you how this works within one type of censorship. So today, I'm just going to focus on the Great Firewall of China, which is just one of the many ways in which China censors the internet. So the Great Firewall of China blocks foreign websites from China. So things like Twitter, Facebook, Google, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg, Dropbox, these are all things you can't access from a Chinese IP address. And you can evade the Great Firewall. It's getting a little bit harder, but you can do it. I was just in China last week, so you can evade it with a VPN, but very few people do. So this is very uncommon, actually, in China. So we don't know exactly how many people evade the Great Firewall, but we think somewhere between 3 to 15% of people do. And I really believe the 3% metric here more than the 15%. These are mostly coming from surveys, and the 15% are from online surveys, which like 50% of China isn't online. So this, I think it's more than the 3% side of things. Now, as of now, it's not technically illegal to evade, although there are actually, they talk about that's changing this month. So this is a very dynamic space, but the data that I'm going to show you, that people aren't sanctioned for evading the firewall during that time period. Okay, so this is like going to be a very new thing if people are actually sanctioned for evading the firewall. Using a VPN is not, has not in the past been something that has been sanctioned. Distributing VPNs can be, but using one is not. So this is very much a form of friction, okay? What it means is that if you want to evade this type of censorship, if you want to get on Facebook from China, you have to spend some money, you have to spend some time, you have to download a VPN, you have to get around the firewall. And this just is a barrier for you to access, even though it's not sort of not allowed. It's not that it's not allowed for you to do this. So I'm going to use sort of surveys, sort of social media exhaust, which you guys are used to using, and some NLP to basically show that the firewall is extremely effective statically. That very few people jump in, and most people are sort of kept off of these websites because of the firewall. And I'm going to show you this in a few ways. First, I'm going to show you it statically, and then I'm going to show you it through an interrupted time series, so a few interrupted time series, where the firewall sort of has really sudden impacts on internet traffic. Like if something has been blocked by the firewall, like many, many fewer people visit that website. There's big, overnight, actually over the hour and minute effects on what people are accessing. I'm going to show you that it pulls capable, politically interested individuals away from the masses. So what it does is it separates out two different sort of types of people in China. It separates out people who are interested in politics and connected with foreigners and educated and wealthy, and from people who sort of have less interest in these types of issues. But I'm going to show you that it has an Achilles heel, that it's less effective during crises with the sudden censorship of websites and when there are few substitutes. So when people's demand for information becomes inelastic, the firewall is not that big of a barrier because they can get over it. So there are time periods when they want to get over it. So I'm going to use this paper that I wrote with one of your guys' colleagues, William Hobbs, about how censorship can increase access to information. I'm going to draw on that paper to show you that, one of the examples. So who jumps the firewall in mainland China? So I think I'm going to kind of start with this static picture, right, which is not going to give us sort of a causally identified effect of the firewall on consumption of information, but it's just going to sort of describe what's going on statically, okay? And then I'll show you some interrupted time series. So I was able to put a few questions in on a survey of 3,500 urban residents in the summer of 2015. So these are urban residents of China, and this is a survey done all over China. And about 5% of people said that they jumped the firewall, okay? So the people who tend to jump the firewall sort of have more tools to evade censorship, and they also have more reasons to evade censorship, okay? So of the people who jump the firewall, 75% have,
Maybe you say later, but can you say more about how you recruit the participants of the survey and how actually you ask the question, like the actual question or something like that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the survey, what we did was we randomly sampled different urban areas within China, and then within those urban areas, there was a face-to-face survey, and it was geo-sampled within urban areas. So the online surveys, I think, are less trustworthy within China just because there aren't enough people online. But this is basically done at a face-to-face way, and we also don't use like random telephone digit dialing or even addresses because there are a lot of migrant workers. So then so basically it helps sort of get an entire, you actually go to the location and then go door to door, and then you can get sort of a more representative sample. Yeah, so that's how it was done. There are some provinces that were excluded from Tibet and Xinjiang were excluded from the sample.
Actually, and how did you know, like you went door to door, but you knew people had internet connection there, or you just find out there? So you said 5% of the people had internet, or 5% of the...
So 5% of total people jump the firewall. So some of these people just don't have an internet connection, and then they're not jumping the wall. So that was one of the first questions that we asked, is if they actually used the internet. If they didn't use the internet, then we didn't ask them a bunch of questions about their internet use. Yeah.
Right. Is it mobile, like internet in terms of like mobile, or just computer?
Yeah, so most of the people in China use through mobile, about 85% use through mobile, and that's what we found. That's both reported by the Chinese government and also what we found within the survey. Yeah, so we included both mobile and land internet use.
Thank you so much.
Yep, for sure, yeah. So that people who are more educated, if they, on average, are more educated if they jump the wall, than other internet users who, these are 25% of internet users have a college degree versus 75% of people who jump the wall. Average family income is much higher than your average internet user. They're much more likely to say they can speak English rather than the average internet user. And they also sort of have more expected benefits of evasion. So 60% said they followed international politics versus 28% for your average internet user. And 12% said they work at a foreign enterprise versus less than 1% for your average internet user. So definitely a foreign enterprise is going to make you more likely to use a VPN. 48% of VPN users said they had been outside of China, which includes Hong Kong and Macau. So this isn't like going to the US, but versus 6% of your average internet user. They're also much more likely to be in sort of these coastal areas, so we see a lot more people jumping the wall. This is like the proportion of people jumping the wall in sort of Beijing and sort of in more of the coastal areas. And you can't really see Shanghai here, but Shanghai has really high proportion of people jumping the wall also. One of the big correlates of jumping the wall is age. So this is probably the strongest correlate of jumping the wall. So Here we have age, and then we have like the 4 sort of categories that we, how we ask the question of jumping the wall. So first of all, about half of people just don't use the internet. Those tend to be older people, not really younger people. We asked people if they didn't know what the firewall was, if they knew what the firewall was. A lot of people just don't know what the firewall is, at least they didn't say they knew what the firewall was. And that tends to be like this big chunk here. Then there are some people who know what the firewall is, but they don't jump the firewall. And then there are these few people who sort of jump the firewall. And this is a much bigger proportion of population for people under 34. This is like basically if the internet came to China before you went to college, you're just much more likely to jump the firewall. And I think this sort of could explain what, some of the crackdowns that we're seeing on the firewall now is that, these people are getting older and younger people are just more likely even than that to jump the firewall. So why don't users jump the wall? So we asked them if they knew what the firewall was and they didn't jump the wall. We asked them why they didn't jump the wall. So very few people said, we asked them this because they were fearful. So very few people said it was because they were fearful. Only 2%. We did ask them if they had legal concerns because we were worried that even though people aren't sanctioned for jumping, at this time we're not sanctioned for not jumping the firewall, we were worried that maybe people thought it was legal or something. But actually not very many people said that they had legal concerns. Most people said either it was too bothersome or they don't know how. So there's they couldn't actually, it was just annoying to do it, or they couldn't really figure out how to do it, or they had no reason to. So a lot of people said, they didn't have a reason to jump the firewall. Yeah, and then some people didn't answer. So I think that these really get at this friction thing. Is that what's happening here is that people are don't have the type of demand for information that sort of motivate them to get across the wall. So you might think, okay, well this is an interesting survey that we know that there are lots of problems with surveys that people falsify their preferences, maybe they don't want to talk about it, we're only looking at urban residents, so probably all of this is a little bit different when you go to rural areas in China. So we also decided to look at geolocated social media posts to try to sort of try to figure out if we could get at the same types of quantities with geolocated social media posts. So here we collected some geolocated social media posts from September of 2014. So this is a Twitter stream. This is a random sample of all geolocated tweets. It's about 1/3 of all geolocated tweets. And the innovation here is that one thing that we realized is that by the geolocation by GPS sort of measures Great Firewall evasion. So when you evade the firewall with a VPN, you mask your IP, you log into a computer outside of China, and then you go through the firewall. But when you're on your phone and you're using a social media app, your actual GPS is geolocating you to wherever you are. So if you're geolocating to China and you're on Twitter, for example, then which has been blocked by the firewall since 2009, then you're most likely using a VPN. So we're trying to do some back-of-the-envelope calculations of what this means for firewall evasion. So within this random sample of all geolocated tweets from around the world, about 1,700 users per day came from mainland China. Okay, so if we think that this is geolocated tweets, this is just really back-of-the-envelope calculation here. Geolocated tweets are maybe 2 to 3% of the Twitter stream. Then maybe this is 1% of all tweets, right? So maybe if we make a few assumptions, we can say that maybe there are 170,000 users tweeting every day from mainland China, okay? So if you look at Hong Kong is not affected by the firewall, but probably the closest place that we could kind of use as a control group, okay? So Hong Kong is under the mainland China's government control, has the same sort of other social media sites that are available, and we see that about 905 users per day are coming from Hong Kong. So that's a total of probably 90,000 total users on back of the envelope, right? So back of the envelope calculation, if we divide this number of total users in Hong Kong by the total internet population in Hong Kong, we get about 1.7% of Hong Kong internet users are participating or posting on Twitter every day, versus 0.02% of Chinese internet users, okay? So this is about 1 to 2% of users in China in comparison to Hong Kong, right? Which is kind of similar to what we're getting within the survey, right? So this is making a lot of assumptions about the representativeness of geolocated users, and also about like the comparability between Hong Kong and China. But I think it kind of gives you a sense of like, this really comes actually pretty close to some of the estimates that we're getting within the survey, and kind of gives you a sense of the sort of proportion of people we think participating on the unfiltered internet from China. We also get sort of similar things. So this is from the appendix of Bill and my paper on Instagram, is that we get really similar things when we compare geolocated Twitter to geolocated Weibo. Okay, so Weibo is like the Chinese version of Twitter, but really similar sort of patterns of what we see in the survey. Is that this is just the Beijing area. We did this sample, sample of the Beijing area geolocated Weibo versus Twitter. What we see is that on Weibo, yeah, most of the tweets are coming from the cities, but there are also a lot coming from sort of the surrounding areas. If we compare that to Twitter, basically almost all of the activity is happening in Beijing, with a little bit in Tianjin, okay? So the tweets coming from China are much more concentrated in urban areas, which is something that we see within the survey also. So we can also look at the differences, the topical differences between what people talk about on Twitter versus what people talk about on Weibo, right? So we have a whole bunch of tweets from this sample, right, that are coming from Twitter and coming from Weibo in the same area during the same time period. Can we look and see what are the differences in the way they talk about things? So what I'm going to just use for this is like a topic model, okay, which allows, and I'm going to use the structural topic model, which is basically the latent density allocation with some covariate information, okay? So if you guys, I'm not going to go over this in too much detail, but the structural topic model is something I've been working on for a while, which just allows you to sort of add in covariates to the latent density allocation in order to estimate how topics are different between two groups or differ over time or this type of thing, okay? So the basic idea is that it allows topical prevalence in the latent density allocation to vary by metadata. So it allows you to estimate how the amount a document talks about a topic varies by a particular covariate. And it also, so for example, you can estimate how much the topic varies, the amount that a person talks about the topic varies by if they're on Weibo versus they're on Twitter. Okay. And it also allows you to estimate how much topical content can vary by metadata. So you can estimate, for example, if Weibo and Twitter talk about the same topic differently, like they are like using different words to talk about the same topic. So I'm not gonna. So we showed in a few different papers that like kind of being able to include this metadata sort of allows you to get more accurate estimation and sort of better qualitative interpretability. Okay. So I'm not going to go into this very much, but I can definitely talk about it later if you guys are interested. So here I'm just going to show you I just ran like 50 topics on the joint data set with a covariate of whether or not the tweet was on Weibo versus on Twitter. Right, so same time period, same geography. And then I'm just going to show you the topics that are most prevalent on Weibo versus Twitter, and the topics that are most prevalent on Twitter versus Weibo. So the topics with the biggest differences between the two, okay, for this time period. So here are the topics that are more likely to appear on Twitter versus on Weibo, and so I just translated them. So here are the words in the topic that are most likely if you were in that topic, and then I labeled them with these labels, okay? So I'm in Beijing or Tianjin is like basically a topic that's just about Beijing and Tianjin, which sort of makes sense because we see all of those tweets in Beijing and Tianjin, so they're kind of, and they're geolocating, so they're often kind of talking about. We also see a lot more about tech on Twitter. So Twitter is just full, Chinese Twitter is just full of tech. People talking about tech, like the iPhone and like different apps and like this type of thing. VPNs, Apple, like these types of things. We see a lot more about education and about universities. So we see more about like school and university and jobs and this type of thing. And then here, because this is September of 2014 when the Hong Kong protests started, we also see all this talk about freedom and democracy in Hong Kong and demonstration on Twitter that we don't really see on Weibo. Okay. So these are the types of things, like we see this over and over. It doesn't kind of matter how you slice the data. You get more urban stuff, you get more education stuff, you get more tech stuff, and you get more political stuff on Twitter. On Weibo, on the other hand, people talk about things that most people in the world talk about social media. So this includes celebrities. So this topic is about this celebrity Wei Chen, the singer, who's on like some show, and they're rooting for him. What I did today, so like yesterday I did this, today I did this, I went to sleep, etc. The weather. And then like life advice, like think like some of like a lot of the tweets on this topic are kind of like motivational things and that kind of thing. So actually, if you look at Hong Kong, which is unfiltered by the firewall, most people look like this too, right? If you look at the U.S., most people look like this. So most people on the internet talk about celebrities and what they did today and like these types of things. And the Chinese Twitter sphere is just a really different space because of this selection into the Twitter sphere, like because of the types of people who are willing to jump the firewall tend to be a different type of people than the rest of people in China. Yeah. Okay, so we get kind of similar things when we look actually at the social media data as we look at the survey. These people are more educated, they're more interested in politics, they're more likely to have like international connections, they're more likely to be wealthy, they're more likely to live in urban areas, right? They're just a different type of people, okay? And yeah. So, but what about like, so you could say, well, this doesn't really tell us very much about like if the firewall wasn't in China, what we would see on Twitter, right? Like that's a really hard counterfactual to estimate from that data. So let's just look at some of the dynamic effects of the Great Firewall, okay? I think this gives us a little bit more leverage onto like how the Great Firewall impacts things sort of quickly within China. So the first example I'm going to just show you is just from the Google Transparency Google data that they have online. But this is basically just the proportion of Google traffic that's coming from China, okay? And what happened with Google, if you don't remember, is that in 2010, Google had like this fight with the Chinese government, where they essentially alleged that the Chinese government had hacked them. And they decided that they were going to stop censoring for China. So if you operate in China as a social media company, you have to follow the rules of China, which is in Google's case, they have to search filter, right? So they decided instead of search filtering, they were going to redirect to google.com HK, Hong Kong version of Google, which is not search filter. Okay. So then the Chinese government decided, okay, well, they didn't actually even block Google at first by the firewall. They just throttled it. So Google only loaded like 75% of the time. But can you imagine? Like, I mean, I was in China I think in 2010 and 2011, and it was just like such a pain to access your mail. Like you could do it, but you would have to like really take deep breaths, right? And so it was like throttled for basically 4 years. And what we just see is even just with this throttling, the percentage of traffic coming from Google just goes down. And then what happened was there was a permanent block before the June 4th anniversary in 2014. And we see just like the traffic drops down more. So basically Google has very, very little market share in China anymore. And this is basically due to the throttling and blocking from the Great Firewall. We also see this in other sort of more specific cases. So if you look at the total Chinese language Wikipedia page views, so Wikipedia has also had a very fraught relationship with the Chinese government. Wikipedia has been on and off blocked since it first created a Chinese language webpage. But usually Wikipedia is blocked selectively in China. So usually there are only certain pages that are blocked, like things about Tiananmen Square, things about top leaders in China, things about Mao, etc. Okay. So what happened was Wikipedia decided that they were going to reroute all of their HTTP traffic to their HTTPS site, so their encrypted version of their site. And they decided they were going to do this in 2015. And so what this would prevent the firewall from knowing what people were doing on Wikipedia, and so it would prevent them from selectively blocking. So then the Chinese government decided to block the entire site on May 15th of 2014, or May 19th of 2015. So what happened basically is you can get total Wikipedia page views for every page. You can get it by the hour from Wikimedia, their foundation. And so basically this is just showing the total page views of Chinese language Wikipedia pages. And we see that on May 19th, and actually you can look at this you know that exactly what hour they blocked it, because it's just like such a dramatic effect on page views all of a sudden. So we still have some page views of Chinese language Wikipedia pages, but probably most of these are coming from outside of China, and then some of them probably coming from people on VPNs as well. Okay, so big dynamic effects of the firewall on page views. Okay. So I think what I've hopefully convinced you is that the firewall and friction is really effective at like rerouting people on the internet. That especially people who kind of don't care very much or don't have a reason to jump the firewall. There's just not that much persuading them to kind of go out of their way to jump in. So now I'm just going to show you a little bit of data on friction's Achilles heel. So this is friction itself, as I've shown you, is sort of relying on the indifference and the impatience of internet users, right? So this is sort of what we call in politics rational ignorance, right? Is that most people are rationally ignorant. They don't actually have that much influence on politics. They have a lot of other things going on in their lives. And so it's rational for them not to inform themselves about politics, right? This also is magnified, I think, when, especially on the internet, there are a lot of substitutes. And in China, there are a lot of homegrown substitutes. So it's easy to switch to those types of substitutes. And also often by the low visibility of censorship. So I show in other parts of the book that when censorship is really visible, people sometimes will make up for it. But especially when they're not really sure if it's being censored or they can explain it away, then they're sort of even more affected by friction. So the exception to this is when when people all of a sudden have a reason to get around censorship. So I'm going to show you just two examples of this within the data. So one is crisis. So I'm going to show you that during the Chinjung Explosion in 2015, that there were many more people who were willing to jump the firewall. So crisis situation in Tianjin. I'm also going to show you sort of sudden censorship disruptions. So this is from Will in my paper that especially sudden visible censorship with fewer substitutes gets people over the wall because they have a reason to go continue to access that website. And this acts as a gateway effect by giving them then access to everything else that they've been missing since the firewall has been blocking things. So I'll start with the Chinjung Explosion in 2015. So what happened in Tianjin in 2015 is that there was a large chemical explosion at a plant in the middle of Tianjin, which is really close to Beijing. This killed 173 people. It injured hundreds. It was highly visible. So this was like in the center of the city. And it was broadcast on real time by social media. So there were like some people filming things and they would like see this huge explosion. Like these are like high rises, right? Like this is a huge explosion in the middle of the city, basically. And there was a lot of confusion in the aftermath, as you can imagine. Like if this huge thing blew up in the middle of the city, you would be like, what happened? Are we getting attacked? Like what's going on? Like, there's a lot of questions about what was happening, okay? So the survey that I mentioned before was actually in the field before and after the explosion in Tianjin, okay? And even though the people that we sampled before and after are not completely at random, the biggest difference between people before and after the explosion was their use of VPNs. So what we see is that these different clusters were the different sort of geo-clusters of people that we were interviewing in Tianjin, that the numerators were interviewing. And these are the proportion of internet users who jumped the firewall, okay? We see it's pretty low within the first wave, but in the second wave after the Tianjin explosion, it goes up by like 25%, okay, percentage points. So what we see is, and we don't know exactly why, right? But even when you control for like many, many things, this result doesn't go away. And so we think that maybe this could be because of the explosion, and we don't really see this in any other study. Okay, so the other example of this sort of friction's Achilles heel is that on September 29th of 2014, Instagram was blocked in China. So Instagram, you guys probably, most of you probably know what Instagram is, but I get people who don't, which is just this, it's basically a popular photo sharing application owned by Facebook, here exemplified by its most followed user, Selena Gomez, who for just even this selfie got like 4 million likes, okay? So there are 600 million users worldwide, and like the thing you do on Instagram is you like people's pictures, right? So there are 4.2 billion likes per day. Like this is a very interactive platform, and there's lots of actually psychological research about like how addictive Instagram is, okay? And interestingly, this is something that's used sort of all over the world. So 80% of Instagram's users are outside of China. And starting in 2011, there were about 100, we don't know how many people were actually using Instagram in China in 2014. So we've been trying to figure this out. But we think it started in 2011, one of the founders of Instagram said that there are 100,000 downloads of the app per week in China. So we think there were quite a few people using Instagram in China during this time period. But on September 29th of 2014, it was blocked by the Great Firewall. And it was blocked because this was the third day of the Hong Kong protests. So what happened in Hong Kong was that people started protesting outside of government offices, and basically they were concerned of mainland interference into Hong Kong government, right? And this started the Umbrella Revolution, which you guys probably heard about. It went on for months. This was like a really, really big deal. The Chinese government allegedly was concerned that pictures of the protests and the tear gas used on protesters would spread from on Instagram from Hong Kong to mainland China. So they blocked Instagram just in mainland China and not in Hong Kong. So interestingly, Instagram, the effect of the block had sort of what we would expect. The block had sort of the expected effect on Instagram use in China. So we collected geolocated Instagram posts from China between September 1st of 2014 and October 31st of 2014 from the API. And the way that we did this is we took like the map of China and we sampled coordinates based on, with a probability proportional to population. And then for any coordinate, we took all of the posts within that coordinate for the entire time period, okay? And so we think we got probably like, maybe like a quarter to 1% of all of Instagram posts, okay? The Instagram API kind of shut us off because they closed the API to researchers right after we collected this. But the number, not because of us, but just because of other policy things. So this is the number of unique geolocated Instagram users within our sample. Here's the Instagram block. And what we see is that we get a big effect of the Instagram block on use of Instagram, just like Wikipedia and any of this other stuff. We see that about 53% of users continue to use Instagram versus in comparison to the pre-block. But it's actually kind of a lot if you think about it, especially because we know all of these are coming from China. So this is a lot of people continuing to use Instagram given the number of people evading the firewall. So what happened? So what happened was that all of a sudden, because of the Instagram block, people wanted to be on Instagram so badly that they downloaded a VPN to be on Instagram. Okay? So this is just from App Annie, which is this iPhone application site, analytics site. And this is the iPhone application rank in China of VPN Express and VPN Artifact, which are the two most popular VPNs during this time period. And they went from like 1,600, this is on a log scale, to like top 10 overnight. So all of a sudden, everybody downloaded a VPN on the day of the Instagram block, right? These became extremely, extremely more popular. And what this did is it had an impact on all of the other blocked sites within China. So if we look at our Twitter sample, the number of unique users in China went from, this is Hong Kong, which stayed pretty flat during this time period. And in China, on the day of the Instagram block, like many, many more people started using Twitter. And we see that not only did more people start using Twitter, that we see like a 600% increase in the number of people who signed up for Twitter that day. So these are new users of Twitter. These are people who, because of Instagram, downloaded a VPN and then tried Twitter. So actually my favorite quote from one of the new Twitter users was, "Today, China's not on Instagram. So I downloaded something and then I tried Twitter. Now I can pay attention to Justin Bieber." That was pretty funny. We also see this on Facebook. So like this is iPhone application rank in China of Twitter and on Facebook. And we see on the day of the Instagram block, we see big increases in the popularity of both Facebook and of Twitter. And we see generally that like a lot of Chinese language users gained more followers because of the Instagram block. So here's the follower sign up date. And these are just people we took who we know are following New York Times Chinese. And we looked into when they signed up for Twitter. And a whole bunch of them signed up on the day of the Instagram block, right? So New York Times Chinese is blocked in China. And all of a sudden got all of these more followers because of the the Instagram block. And in general, if we took sort of like a random sample of 2,000 popular Chinese Twitter users, and we figured out how many, based on their pre-block trend, how many users they should be getting from every sign-up date. And we subtracted that off, and then we estimated how many more users they got because of the Instagram block, more followers. And for this 2,000 users, they got 33,000 more followers than we would have expected because of the Instagram block. So all of a sudden, people are coming from, and actually what's really interesting about this is Twitter, as we've seen in China, is like a really political space. Instagram is not that political, it's mostly selfies, right? So they're coming, because of the Instagram block, they're coming in, crossing the firewall, and they're entering this very political community, right, which is Twitter, which is quite interesting. We also see that there's a big increase in Wikipedia page views on the day of the Instagram block. So this is before the 2015 total block of Wikipedia. And we went to greatfire.org, which is this website that records like what things are blocked in China on what days. And we figured out exactly which pages were blocked by the firewall on the day of the Instagram block. And then we just took the page views of those pages. And then we said, and these pages are like Tiananmen, chop leaders, etc., like really sensitive stuff. And we see a huge increase in the number of people viewing those pages. And actually the biggest increase is coming not on pages about Hong Kong protests, which were blocked during that time period, but actually on pages about Tiananmen Square, which is like people who are first jumping the firewall, they're like, what are they looking at? And this is sort of what we see on Wikipedia. Yeah.
So a question here. It seems like there's this big spike, but then it seems to settle down to the old equilibrium. And I'm wondering what your interpretation of that is, because it really looks like, in the long run, it actually didn't matter that much, and whether that's because people don't adjust how they behave in the long run, or whether the Chinese government took other countervailing measures.
Yeah. So I think part of it is the nature of Wikipedia, which is like once you've seen it once, you sort of like read it.
Yes.
The other thing though is that China did start. It wasn't really until November though. Increased the cost of the VPN basically. So which shouldn't affect this graph. But I think it might be. I think there is a big drop off in users generally. Like people kind of try it, and then a lot of people kind of drop off. And then I think partly it's about Wikipedia. We do see, I don't have this plot in this talk, but we do see that there are persistent effects of the Instagram block even into 2017. But they're more muted than you would expect based on regular people signing up for Twitter. So because these people are like somewhat less political, they're sort of converted onto Twitter at a lower rate overall, but because of their volume, you can still see their effect. So there's like this kind of, countervailing thing. Yeah.
So, we attribute this spike solely to the block itself or to the events that precipitated the block?
So I think some of it can be attributed to the events, and some of it can be attributed to the block. And so we try to kind of break it down in the paper a little bit by looking at the types of pages that people are viewing. And there certainly are increased page views of the things about the Hong Kong protests. But then there are these big increases in just Chinese leaders, especially historical leaders actually, like Deng Xiaoping, and then also Tiananmen Square leaders. And we wouldn't really expect that from the nature of the event going on in Hong Kong. Yeah. So I think there's like a little bit of a combination. Yeah. So interestingly, and I think this is what really sort of is like a puzzle for future research, is that the Achilles heel of censorship doesn't apply to all blocks, right? The Instagram block was special in some way, right? So here is the VPN iPhone rank, VPN Express iPhone rank. And here's that Google block in June of 2014 that I was talking about. And here's the Instagram block, right? Which all of a sudden went from like shut up on the day. And there's the Wikipedia block in 2015, right? And only the Instagram block really, I mean, maybe this is like a delayed thing coming from the Google block, but only the Instagram block really seemed to persuade people to then download a VPN and jump the firewall, okay? And I think what's going on here is this, is that I always wondered before working on this, why the Chinese government throttled Google for 4 years and didn't just block it. And I think that this is the answer, is that it actually can be more effective to do less complete censorship because it doesn't motivate evasion as quickly. So people on Google, you can still access Gmail, right? But after a while, after all your important emails were done, maybe on a weekend, then you switch to Baidu because you're sick and tired of it, right? But on Instagram, it was blocked so suddenly during the Hong Kong protests, you had to see who liked your picture that you posted from yesterday, right? So you had to get over the block immediately, right? And so there's this like interesting thing where, and it also made me more observable, right? So there's this interesting difference. And Wikipedia too is like something that had sort of long been blocked by the Chinese government. Yeah.
So, I don't know about China, but here there's a significant demographic difference between users of Instagram. Is that the same in China? I mean,
yes.
The immediate gratification might be higher in the demographic for Instagram than it would be for others.
Yeah, so that could be going on too. And I think this is why I need future research, because we have like 3 observations, and there are a lot of things that vary between these observations, right? So user base certainly varies. Also substitutability varies, right? Like Instagram really didn't have a substitute, but Baidu does, and Wikipedia has Baidu by Ke as like another version of Wikipedia. And then obviously the suddenness of it and the circumstances around it, right? But if we could collect a lot more observations like this, I think we'd get a better sense of when people are motivated to sort of jump the firewall and when they're not. Yeah. Yeah.
Thinking more about sort of offline social networks. I mean,
Yes.
I think all of us have a grandparent or uncle who doesn't know what the heck a VPN is, but if they needed to get on the internet somehow, they could call their young,
Yeah.
PhD student and find out, right? So I mean, do you think that 50% of people who don't know how to get around the firewall actually do the social capital to do so because they have friends and relatives who know how to get around it?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. And we would expect that, for example, during the Chinjung Explosion or something, right? The people who are sort of more embedded in young, have kids or something like that, right? Would be more likely to be able to get around the firewall. And I think that would be really fascinating to study. But I think you have to do it in like a face-to-face survey, which is hard to do in China. Yeah.
I was wondering, both Google and Wikipedia case, they are more like getting information outside and accessing the news resources. But platforms like Instagram and Twitter is more like reaching out outside of your boundaries. So did you look at like how the preferred languages changed for the users? Because most of the social protests, people start writing other than their native languages and mention the popular people to let them know what is happening. So maybe along with these umbrella protest pictures, they might also posting in English language and mentioning, I don't know, the Barack Obama or other political leaders in other countries.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So we looked at, one of the things that we really wanted to do was study a little bit more about how people might have been affected by being after the Instagram block of jumping the wall, right? And so one of the things we wanted to do is understand people who stayed on Instagram, did they become like more political or something like that? But the problem with Instagram is that it's like really a not political site at all. And in fact, like almost all, we've found very few political posts generally. And so I think what was happening is that these people were mostly just apolitical. And we see this a little bit because of their Twitter profile. So they tend to be less likely to have signed up in English, when the new users who on the day of the block are much less likely to sign up in English than your regular Chinese Twitter user. And they're also much less likely to come from Beijing and Shanghai. And so they're sort of like this other, we think that they're kind of like a different type of person than the person who generally, so they weren't actually politically motivated to get across the wall, that they were motivated by entertainment mostly. And we do see that they start talking about Hong Kong a little bit after they get across the wall. Not the first day, but like the second and third day. And so it might be that they sort of become more aware of politics because of that. Sort of like Ethan Zuckerman's like cute cat theory of censorship idea, right? Like you get drawn into these things by cute cats, and then you enter into politics. But I think that at first they're much less political than your typical user. Yeah.
We noticed actually all these blocks became events. They all corresponding to political events. Like a Google blog actually 25 years anniversary of Tiananmen Square event. And the Wikipedia also the same time in the US. So is there any kind of study like this correlation or just like flags and patterns?
Yeah, so the Google blog certainly is sort of like right around the 10th anniversary. The Wikipedia blog is coming mostly from Wikipedia's tech changes. So like that, I think that's a little bit of a different. And then Instagram is certainly during the Hong Kong protests. The reason why I think what's happening with the VPNs is not, in the Instagram block is not political, is because if you look at these same trends in Hong Kong, you don't see them. So Hong Kong, which is where you think people were more sort of political, right? You don't see them signing up for Twitter or, sort of looking at mostly like the Twitter effects. You also don't see them like downloading VPNs, although they wouldn't need VPNs. So, yeah. So I think that and you also don't see it happening on the first day of the Hong Kong protests, which was a few days before. You see it almost happening completely on the Instagram block. But certainly, I think this is another issue with looking at these three observations, is that the context is different in each case. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest you get to the last
Yes.
2 slides. I'm looking at 30 to 32.
Oh yes, this is the last slide.
And we are, we should get to the conclusion of the talk as well,
sure.
given the talk. But I want to hear the conclusion.
Okay, so how does China maintain one of the most vibrant online communities while still repressing it? So the answer that I sort of put here is it distracts and diverts. It uses friction and flooding to reroute users to other types of information. This sort of separates the masses from the activists, right? And it sort of censors while reducing the perception of censorship. So I think there's this there's this idea that the more censorship is in your face, the more you can account for it. So there's an Achilles heel of friction, though. You crises sudden, more visible censorship. Might be also times when people's demand for information is more inelastic and they're willing to jump the firewall. So the takeaways is that censorship is much more than fear. That's one of the main takeaways from the book. It's also these other nudge tactics. And censorship has sort of an unequal impact on people. So we talk a lot about the digital divide, and censorship in this case is really exacerbating the digital divide. It's making it more difficult for less connected people to get information. This also, I think, has a broader definition of censorship that has implications for democracies. So we think about freedom of information in democracies as not having fear, right? There's no legal ramification for doing something. But there are actually a lot of ways in which authorities in democracies can create friction and flooding. And so we think that if we think about, I think the internet has made sort of censorship a little bit more similar between democracies and autocracies than less similar. So that's it, and more information you can go to my website. Yeah, thanks so much.
So think we have time for just a couple questions, and then we'll have to move along
For
the
sure.
stage. So, I'll let you go.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you had mentioned on Weibo the topics that you found are similar to certain of the topics that you find in other countries as well.
Yeah.
And while you didn't talk about flooding that much in this presentation, I'm sort of curious about the effect of that. Are those topics the result of flooding, do you think?
So it's really hard to know. So in the book I have a whole chapter on flooding, and it's hard to know what flooding. It's hard to actually measure flooding. So Gary and Jen and I have this paper on the Chinese 50-cent party, where we find this leaked data set of online astroturfer posts. And one of the big things that they flood about is during this holiday called Qingming in China, which is this ancestor, go sort of pay respects to your ancestors, which has become political in the past. It has created protests in the past because people are paying respects for political leaders, and actually they've had a lot of trouble with because people pay respects to sort of people who died in Tiananmen. And so under Mao it was actually banned. The holiday was banned. But the Chinese government has made this huge effort to try to retake the holiday and make it a day where people pay respects to the martyrs, which is the martyrs of the revolution. And so we see this huge spike in propaganda during this time period about martyrs, 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 martyrs. And if you look at the proportion of posts coming from so I just took Crimson Hexagon, it has a bunch of social media posts, right? From Chinese social media. And if you look at the proportion of posts that use martyrs with Qingming on all the way from 2012 to this year, you see this increasing on those days, right? This increasing proportion of people talking about the martyrs with Qingming. And so whether or not that's all astroturfers, or you see that there's this, they are sort of taking back the narrative, right? And I think that's the way you're sort of measuring this impact. So I don't know how many. We have very little data on flooding generally, so I don't know how many of the actual topics are coming, but we do see some. Yeah.
You kind of touched on this at the end, but I'm curious as to kind of the remarkable overlap this has with fighting fake news or something like that. It's another form of information management where
Absolutely.
we've considered okay, you threaten punishment for posting it, or that's fear. You raise the cost of people finding it and all this stuff.
Yep.
Do you think the same Achilles heels apply? In an event,
Interesting.
is somebody going to go seek out this information because they know it's out there and they're looking for it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think there are really, really kind of eerie overlaps. The Chinese government, they justify their censorship by saying we're going to combat false information and rumors, right? But I would imagine that, say there wasn't a lot of information on mainstream outlets about something, and people really needed to find something, right? Then I think you would see these similar effects of people getting sort of access to other
Kind of
information.
the ban of the people on Twitter and the rise of Gab.
Exactly, yeah. So you can also get these sort of what are they called when you push something down and it comes up?
The whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole, yes. yeah.
Three additional informations from China.
Yeah.
The guy Lu Wei.
Yeah, Lu Wei, yeah.
Yeah, was arrested due to corruption.
Right.
Recently. The second thing, another issue for us to use VPN is for academic issues. We cannot use Google Scholar in China,
Yeah.
which is terrible.
That's terrible.
Yeah. And also China has an inner firewall for academia called CERNAT. CERNAT is to protect the university and the institute, so it's another issue. Other is for Instagram. I just think it's not for Instagram because of the Hong Kong protest. The young generation in Hong Kong, they just occupy the central location and against the governor of the CPC. And some guys want to spread the information to mainland China. They cannot use the Weibo, they cannot use Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah.
So they only choose the Instagram and GitHub.
GitHub, great. Awesome.
And then the government blocked the Instagram and the
Yeah,
GitHub.
that's
So
interesting.
that's one possible reason.
That's interesting because of the young demographic of Instagram. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, no, definitely. I think there would be a really interesting study of censorship's impact on science. I think that would be useful.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to call time there. I'm sorry that there are so many. This is such an awesome talk. We could go on for a long time, so but you can buy the book again.
Thanks for that.
So,
Thank you guys so much for coming in, and y'all for all of your really, really insightful comments. So yeah.
thank you, Bob.
Appreciate it.